Welcome to another special interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Our guest today's resume reads like a who's who of big industry giants. We've got Electronic Arts, we've got Activision, we've got Sierra. This man has seen the inside workings of the industry for the last 30 plus years. Welcome to the show, Chris Garske.
Thank you.
So, Chris, to get started, we try to do this with all of our guests. What is your background, your education, and so forth, and how does that lead you to the video game business?
I was born and raised in Northern California. My father was a history teacher in high school. Both my parents went to Berkeley. So I grew up near Silicon Valley. I majored in history at the university at Santa Barbara. My first love, my biggest passion starting from the time I was about 16 was travel. So I spent a lot of the years between 16 and 28 basically backpacking, going hosteling all around the world. I took several trips around the world as a young man. My intention was to become a lawyer. And I kept delaying law school so that I could take what money I had saved and go traveling. So my pattern was to work for a year and then travel for 6 months, then work for 2 years and travel for a year over and over again. I came back from a long trip abroad soon after my 28th birthday, and I was broke and I needed to make money to go to law school. Through friends, I met Stan Roach, and he was number 2 in the marketing department at Electronic Arts. At that time, EA was about $12 million in revenues, and probably between 45 and 50 people. And he suggested that I come work for him there. And I was excited about it, especially when I got there, because as soon as I walked in the door, I realized that this environment was completely unlike any job I'd had before, and I'd had several. The average level of intelligence was astounding to me. And more importantly, the passion. This was a group of people who seriously believed in the personal computer and the promise of what software could do for people. They also liked having fun, and it was just a wonderful place. And I realized very quickly that the pressure to perform at Electronic Arts was not hierarchical. It wasn't some boss telling you to work harder or achieve this by Friday. It was social, meaning that if you didn't work your ass off, nobody would have lunch with you. It was just expected that you would turn in an A+ job on everything. And I quickly realized that this job would require absolute, total commitment. So I did. I worked 80 hours a week for the next 2 years. Gave up just any kind of personal life, really, and enjoyed it. I enjoyed all of it. I learned a ton. Now, my family, growing up, we were heavily into gaming, but it was old gaming. It was board games, cribbage, chess, traditional games, but we played a lot. My father put himself through college playing poker, and
Really?
So it was taken very seriously in our family. So the gaming aspect was a great fit. I was not technical in the least. In fact, I was kind of legendary for how untechnical I was. When I came in the first day, they plopped a brand new Macintosh on my desk, and it had just come out, these machines. And I had to ask how to turn it on because I had never used anything like it before. I didn't know the difference between hardware and software. I was a real neophyte. But I enjoyed words and writing. And pretty quickly, they gave me most of the packaging and advertising, press releases, sell sheets for the sales force, brochures, anything like that. So classic marketing communication projects. And that's how I spent the next couple of years. Then there was a reorganization, and I was told that I would start being measured on things like profitability and market share. And that's when I became really good friends with spreadsheets, because it impacted me personally. Numbers became my friend. And that's when I moved from being a Marcom guy to more of a business and publishing guy.
Okay. If you don't mind, just to go back before we get too far ahead on this. So when you're first starting out there, if I understand it correctly, you're basically writing, and I don't want to call it ad copy, but you're doing a lot of the marketing materials for the games.
Yes.
Now, how is that organized? Was that a central department, or were you working on individual products and they'd have somebody doing it, or were you basically doing it across the entire breadth of the product line at that point?
At that point, the marketing department at EA was 6 people, and we did all the marketing for all the products. There was the vice president was Bing Gordon, and Stan was his head of product marketing. I was Stan's helper. There was also a print production person, Nancy Fong, and a PR person. And then there was a person who did the manuals, the game manuals, David Grady. And we were a very close-knit team, all sitting next to each other and working on every project that came along, every game that came along. So sometimes one of the other staff would take a special interest in a product and be more involved in the churning out of all the various materials that were required. But generally, we all worked on everything.
Oh, okay. And obviously, EA was famous for the standardization, the album cover, packaging. How did you guys work with those packaging elements as far as the design and how appropriate they were for the individual products? How much information about what it should be did you get from the producers, and how much was created internally with the marketing department?
The decision to go to the album style packaging was made before my arrival. The thinking was that the products would be faced out on the shelves, and that would give us an ability to have a arresting, attention-grabbing visual. Over time, we realized that too many of the products were being shelved like books, and therefore we sort of gradually moved toward a more, well, the kind of packaging you see today. One of the important people around Electronic Arts was Jerry Moss of A&M Records. He was on the board of directors, and he would often be asked by the executives at EA for his advice about how to think about marketing issues and distribution issues from the point of view of a record company executive. And so I think that had something to do with it as well. It also had the input of Goodby Berlin and Silverstein, the ad agency that EA had hired at their founding, a group of geniuses in San Francisco whose work was amazing. Electronic Arts stopped using that agency right around the time I began, because it seems to me that there was a little bit of a pause in the flow of products, and they just couldn't afford them for a while. They would have liked to have kept using them.
Gotcha. You were writing copy. Was the marketing department also in charge of maintaining relationships with retailers and also with third parties? Because I think it's around this time that was EA already doing the affiliated publisher program where they were also distributing other companies' software?
That started, I think, just a few months after I began, and I was made the day-to-day point contact person for those affiliated labels, we called them. Origin Systems, SSG, what was the name of the company that did Mavis Beacon typing? And Chessmaster 2000, I think it was called.
Yeah, I got it on the tip of my tongue. I've got the logo in front of my head. It kind of looked like the Wells Fargo logo.
Yeah,
It wasn't the Learning Company. I'll think about it. I'll think of it when I don't need it.
me too. Yeah. So we were not particularly involved in maintaining relationships with retail. That was the sales force that did that. We would occasionally join them on the road to make presentations to merchandisers or buyers at large corporations, but generally speaking, the sales force did all of that. And I would work with the affiliates, but I didn't do the packaging or the advertising stuff for them. They did that. And essentially, we acted just as the distribution company for the packages that they made.
Gotcha. Oh, and it was Software Toolworks.
That's it.
Yeah. Sorry, I just looked it up here in the other window. Okay. Okay. So now, what was the relationship like between you and these affiliated labels? Was it just really, is the product ready? And one of the questions that I always had about this, were they physically producing the product and sending it to you and you would ship it out? Or were you just a coordination point between them? Or was EA manufacturing the product, the boxes and so forth?
I can't remember. I think we did the manufacturing as well as the distribution, but they did all of the, deciding what went on the box and in the box. They did their own quality control on everything.
Okay.
But I think we were selling the manufacturing and distribution services for a percentage of the revenues.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you move out of this position. What was the purpose of the restructuring, and did you have any say in where you would go inside the company?
The purpose of the reorganization, I think, was designed to allow people to specialize in the things that they were best at. That it had mainly to do with the producers, the guys who were getting the hit products built. And so we were broken into three groups. One was a group that did mostly stories, like role-playing games and strategy games, another group that did primarily action and sports, and another group that did creativity and productivity software. And I was not given any role in the choosing. No, I was too choosy. I felt appreciated and for my contributions, but I was a couple layers down from the guys making the decisions.
Gotcha. And so where exactly did you end up, and what was your function then after the reorganization?
I ended up working for Joe Ibarra, and Joe was in charge of our little division, which did RPGs and strategy type games. And in that group with me were Dave Albert and Roland Kippenhahn and a couple of other guys. And we were the smallest group, I think, of the three. But we had the good fortune to have some pretty good products coming online at that time. And so we made money, which was what I mainly cared about.
Okay. And at this point, I'm guessing this was, what, 86-ish? Or?
Yeah, would have been late 86 or early 87.
Gotcha. And was this already this must have been at least the transition of the point of EA going from using exclusively outside developers to doing some more in-house development?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
They were still outside only at that time.
Okay. And so what was that relationship like? I mean, how much control did you have over what developers who are outside of EA were doing?
That's a question for the producers. They were the ones who found the development groups, who got their projects approved within the company and funded. An analogy I heard at the time was that they were like A&R guys in the record business. They were out finding the talent. And the great news is that EA had a bunch of really talented producers who, number one, understood the risks involved. When you do a publishing deal, which is advances against royalties, much like the book or the record industry, you have to understand all the risks. What are the risks that your lead programmer is going to find Jesus and disappear for a year into Guatemala to build a church? That's what happened with Bard's Tale 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the product was delayed because the lead programmer went through a change.
Oh, wow.
Cost us our biggest product of the Christmas season that year. You have to understand, what are the odds that this development group is going to misuse funding? What are the odds that there's going to be a technological shift that they won't be able to keep up with? There's just all these different arenas of risk, and the producers need to understand that and know how to manage it. And EA had really good ones. And that's how they were able to come up with so many hits.
Gotcha. And you were still doing marketing functions? No, you said you were doing more of the financial aspect, the spreadsheets.
Well, because I was told I was going to be measured by that, that became part of my job. But my actual day-to-day stuff was mostly still marketing communications, packaging, ads, all that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
And working with the team on visuals. We wanted everyone to buy in on the decisions we made, you know. So when we were working on a package visual, we would go to the producers and often to the external developers and say, "What do you think? You know, what do you think about this? Here are 4 or 5 different options for a good visual for the package. What do you like? Also, the headline for the ad. You know, what do you think?" We didn't want the product development side to not feel like they were part of that process. It was really important that everybody agreed on the direction that we were going for any individual product.
I can imagine that would have led to at least a few minor conflicts or a lot of back and forth at certain points.
Yeah, occasionally there would be some push and pull about what to emphasize about a product. There'd be a product that had, you know, amazing visuals and average sound and an average sort of storyline or plot. And you might have a key principal in the development team who felt more wedded to one of those things than the other. And so, yeah, there occasionally, but most of the time at EA, one of the many things I loved about Electronic Arts was that they had a corporate culture of not letting things fester. If there was a disagreement, Trip or Larry or Bing would bring the principals into a room and make you lay your position out on the table and talk it through and find agreement. And once you left the room, everybody was on the same page. That was the requirement. And so other companies that I went to weren't as far advanced in that arena, and it caused a lot of problems. You'd have a situation where a large chunk of the company might feel that a particular person in a particular role wasn't as strong as they might have been in another role. But there might be a culture of shielding feelings. You know, if you've got this kind of things going on, you've got to be able to tell the truth. You've got to be able to say, hey, that product isn't going to sell. Which no producer wants to hear, you know, from a marketing or sales guy. Mm-hmm. But you had to be able to say that, and you had to be able to talk about what that meant for the budget. You know, how much money are we going to spend on promoting this product? How much money is it really worth spending to get this product built? If the market for this product is 1,000 copies, and it's only going to go to the niche of the niche that are interested in that category, I can barely afford to make a package for it. So Bing used to say, if your marketing budget is 12% of corporate revenues, that means for every dollar you spend, you have to make $8 back. So think about it that way. What's the bang for the buck? If you come to me and you say you want to spend $100,000 doing print ads in hobbyist magazines, you have to convince me that that's going to increase sales by this number of units in order to earn back that $100,000. So it forced us to be very disciplined about how to think about these things. But basically as a whole, I would say, or to summarize, at Electronic Arts, the squabbles were minor and quickly fixed, quickly resolved. And there was very little of the kind of political bickering that I've seen in other places.
Cool. Sounds like a very open place that you were right. It just feels like everybody wanted to create a good product.
Yeah, and everybody was on the same page about what we were doing and where we were going. And that I credit to Trip. Trip was a visionary, and he was able to create a great company, to bring in really good people. He put a lot of emphasis into quality of humans that he was bringing into the building. The interview process was lengthy. You had to meet a lot of people and help them understand why you would be a good addition to the company. And it was a really fun place. You know, when things got tense, somebody would yell Nerf ball fight, and Nerf balls and bats would start flying around the office. And you know, every Friday there'd be a company meeting where Trip or Larry or someone would get up in front of everyone and read what press we'd gotten that week, talk about anything important that was happening within the company. And there was beer. It happened at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So there was a real joie de vivre in that company at that time. I don't know what it's like now.
It's been a while, so yes, I can imagine it may have changed.
Yeah, what's it been, 35 years? Yeah.
So why did you end up leaving EA then?
As a result of the reorganization, a number of people felt dissatisfied with their new position. One of those people was Stan Roach. Stan was a Princeton grad and Harvard MBA who had run marketing for Visicorp. And he was and is a kind of brilliant, absent-minded professor type, really funny, really quirky, really kind, just a terrific guy. And he's the one who hired me and trained me. I got a kind of a day-by-day marketing class from him, and he also spent years at Procter & Gamble doing packaged goods. What did he do? Head and Shoulders, I think, and a couple of others. Yeah, he was like 23, and they gave him $1 billion business to run.
Wow.
That's Procter & Gamble for you. While he was giving me the brand management training, Bing Gordon, his boss, was giving me the creative marketing training. That is, Bing came from the advertising side. One of the most brilliant, I think probably the most brilliant person I've ever met. Perfect scores on his, getting into, where did he go? He went to Yale and then Stanford MBA. And he was the type of guy, one evening I saw him at a dinner for 11 people. He got the check. And he was able to calculate how much you owed with the tip instantly for each person at the table and deliver the news in a 4-line rhyming couplet that said something insightful about your character. I mean,
my Lord.
Yeah, the horsepower of that guy was astounding. So I had these two guys next to me who were giving me just the best training that any person could ask for. But as a result of the reorganization, Stan was made number 2 in the creativity division. And at the same time, his 4-year vesting stock had all vested. So he went to the board or the executive committee and said, you really ought to consider re-upping all those people whose shares have vested. At the same time, he started getting courted by Bruce Davis at Activision. Bruce had been brought in to turn around the company, which had 16 consecutive quarters of losses. And Bruce started courting Stan. Stan turned around and said to a bunch of us young marketing bucks, why don't you come help me turn this company around? And they'll pay you a lot more, number one, but number two, more importantly, Activision is in video games and that's where the action is, and Tripp won't let EA go there, at least not yet. The previous year in '86 was when Nintendo took the world by storm with the NES and Zelda and Mario. And we all knew that's where the action was. You know, these small companies were coming out and selling 2 million copies of things. We were really excited if we sold 100,000 copies of something at Electronic Arts. We were talking to hobbyists, you know, who were sitting around with their Commodore 64 and Apple II and IBM PC Junior. Whereas Activision was with Nintendo selling millions and millions of units. The financial structure of the video game industry was very difficult on third-party publishers, which is why Tripp wasn't interested in doing it. It was very risky and costly, and he felt it was unfair. All very understandable. But I felt personal loyalty to Stan. Stan had brought me in off the street with no qualifications of any kind, except a willingness to work hard and being good with letters and words. So I felt loyalty to him. And I was also tempted by the opportunity to work in video games and make more money for myself personally. In addition to me, Stu Roberson, who was product marketing and creativity, Mike Suarez, who was an up-and-comer in the sports and action category, and a couple of others all came along over the next year or so. But I would say my primary motivation was loyalty.
Okay, and yeah, I've heard many stories from other people about Trip Hawkins not wanting to get into consoles. This was also around the time that he basically makes the big bet that the Amiga is going to be the next big thing. Don't know if that played any role in his anti-console attitude or not.
I don't know how to describe Tripp's motivations. His commitment to the Amiga was, from what I could see, purely based on the quality of what the Amiga could deliver. I think he underestimated the barrier that the price of the machine would turn out to be. But whenever he would talk about Nintendo, Sega was, 2% of the market at that time. They were smaller than the leftover Atari business after the crash in '83. So it was really all Nintendo, and Nintendo required you to take enormous risks, financial risks, in order to play. And Tripp just didn't think it was viable. And so the Amiga just never hit the kinds of volumes that we needed to create an installed base to make money. We made a little money with ports from some of our classic games that we brought over to the platform. And we made pretty good money with, what was it called, Deluxe Paint.
Yeah.
And the sort of primary creative tool on the machine. But that machine remained a niche product. And I don't remember what year Tripp went off and started his machine company.
3DO would have, I think it was not, well, it comes out in '94, but he must have left a few years earlier, so probably 90, 91, somewhere in that area.
I remember him saying that he'd been inspired by a Far Side cartoon, a classic Far Side cartoon where there's a couple of vultures on a branch of a tree, and one of them says, "Sometimes I get tired of being impatient and I just want to go out and kill something." He decided that he was dissatisfied with the console side of the business. He was dissatisfied with the size of the installed base of the Amiga. The personal computer numbers were on the kind of descent. And so he decided to go fix it himself. And I didn't talk much to him after that. I was off in other companies.
Yeah.
So personally, I went to Activision and they made me general manager of the video game division.
Okay.
Which was exciting and challenging. I learned a lot about product development because I'd been a marketing guy before that, and now I was in charge of publishing, meaning deciding what games get built, which is a whole nother set of skills. And I'm very proud to say that the video game division of Activision in those years was the only division out of their 6 divisions that made money. We made money every quarter. And some of that was, what would you call it, a legacy of decisions that had been made earlier. And some of it was me and my team. But the other divisions, the personal computer game division, the productivity software division, none of the other divisions were able to turn a profit. And ultimately, the 3 years or so I was at Activision, the president of the company, the CEO, changed the company's strategic vision more than once. So I was always of the opinion that the company should shrink down to its core competency, which was video games, focus like a laser beam on that and that alone, shrink the company's overhead way, way down to 10 or 12 people instead of the 150 or 200 that we had, most of whom were working on divisions that weren't profitable and never would be. I wrote a memo to that effect. Must have been in 1989 or so. A couple years later, I was working at Sega, and Bobby Kotick, who bought Activision at the time, he sat down with me. He said, "I just came across that memo you wrote." Because you were exactly right, and that's everything that I've done. Yeah, I wish that I could have gotten the company to do what Bobby did earlier. It would have been better for everyone involved.
You mean they shouldn't have purchased Infocom in 1990?
That was one of the things I said. Yeah. Well, they sent me out to Infocom shortly thereafter. Actually, I think they bought Infocom before that, didn't they?
Oh, and I think it's 89. I'd have to look it up again, but yeah, I think they buy them in 89.
Yeah.
Or late 89, early 1990. Yeah.
Yeah, I went out to Boston and did the tour and talked to all the principals and came back and I said, this company is worth 1/6 of what you paid for it. And there are probably 2 people at the company that would be worth bringing over. And they should be brought out to California. The text adventure as a category is dead. You'll be able to make some money doing compilations. Here's 3 great text adventures for 1999, something like that, for nostalgia appeal. But as a going concern, this is a terrible mistake, and it wasn't the only one the company made.
Yeah, that's true. Well, they spent a lot of money also developing productivity software at Infocom, if I remember the story correctly.
Yeah, and Activision did. Mediagenic had a division that was, its intention was to compete with Microsoft, which I thought was insane.
Okay, so you actually went out to Infocom to assess that. Now, at the time you are developing product for the NES, I believe around this time also Activision starts to release some product on the Sega Master System right towards the end of that system's life, right before Genesis comes out. How did that come about?
Essentially, Sega was a very small player in North America and realizing that they needed allies, and they essentially bought Activision's alliance. What they did was they approached us and said, here are 3 Master Systems games that we will essentially give you. for a very advantageous price, which then you can turn around and distribute in North America, and you can make all the money. We'll take a small royalty, but we need a strong player to help us get our foothold in North America. And so I flew out to Japan with, I guess it was Dick Lehrberg and probably Jeff Mulligan. No, actually Bruce Davis was there. The CEO and myself and Dick Lehrberg flew out to Tokyo, and we did the deal with them. I think it had been largely arranged in advance. There wasn't much negotiation involved. Activision needed products at that time, that quarter, and that bought us some breathing room, which is really good. And in turn, I met a number of the executives at Sega and came to really like them. Mr. Sakurai, who ran International, Mr. Ishihara, who ran at that time North America and later took over Europe for them. Just terrific guys, and I became friendly with them. And ended up going to Japan, I don't know, must be 6 or 8 times over the next couple of years, working with Sega. Also calling on Nintendo in Kyoto, because Bruce correctly calculated that Nintendo wouldn't punish us for doing business with Sega, even though people worried that they might, because the world of Japanese corporate warfare is pretty brutal. You know, you don't really in Japan get the choice to play both sides. If it's Nintendo versus Sega, you have to pick which team you're on. Bruce was in the process of helping Nintendo with some legal matters at the time. His background was law, and he testified as an expert witness on behalf of Nintendo at the same time that he was doing this deal with Sega. So my understanding from Bruce is that Nintendo expressed some mild chiding overtones, perhaps, but it was inconsequential. Mr. Arakawa and Howard Lincoln, who were running North America, were always the height of gentlemen to me and to us, even as that all was going on. And so I'm not sure what more to say about that. Yeah, we got into a relationship with Sega, and it lasted for a couple of years. And it ended up having a big impact on my career as well.
And before I make the jump to your next, the move on from Activision, the NES market, as you were experiencing it through Activision, was Activision doing internal development, or were they still working with outside teams? And how did development for consoles at that time differ from development for home computers as you had seen it at EA?
All of our development was external. The differences in the technology between the formats is an area of technology that I'm not comfortable commenting on, because I don't understand the technology well enough.
Okay.
It looked to me that competent programmers could, move from platform to platform without too much trouble. Guys that we used to build the software for the NES, in many cases, had their careers were coming up through the Apple II, for example. And the biggest challenge for us at the time was the chip shortage. There was a shortage in the important chips, and Nintendo had to allocate them. And they did that based on their analysis of each product's market potential. So we'd have a situation where we'd get an order for, we'd have a game and we'd go out, and Toys R Us and Walmart and everybody would order 600,000 copies, and we'd be counting the money, and then Nintendo would contact us once a quarter and say, yeah, that game, you're going to get 100,000 copies. That's your allocation. Now, to be fair, they were doing that across 30 companies. They were saying, we know what the market for Mario is. We know what the market for Zelda is. We know what the market for these games will be. when it comes to something like, a hit game coming out of the coin-op business, they broke some hearts. There were some guys in the industry who were like, I could have sold 2 million copies of this, and I only got to sell 200,000. It's just, it's a horrible situation. That was the driving basis of everybody's experience with the NES between 1987 and probably 1991.
Gotcha. And what you said that as general manager, you got to decide what products got developed, and what was that choosing process like? What was that quality or that selection process like at that time? Was it about getting pitches from outside developers and then following them through at different milestones? Was it you giving pitches that were internally developed to outside studios? What did that process look like at the time?
It was all of those things. Sometimes it was taking an existing property and going out and finding a developer that would be willing to build the product. Sometimes it was like, okay, we own Ghostbusters 2. What's that game look like? And, on a platform? Is it top down? Is it side scroller? Is it strategic? We would work with different groups, find a group that would do it for a fair price and get it built. One of the things I observed in those years is that the development community, dozens and dozens, hundreds of small companies mostly, making games. There were two types of guys running those companies. There were the passionate technologist, quality guys who just wanted to make the world's best game of that type. And then there were the money guys who had a company because they wanted to make money. The money guys would consistently deliver B products, B+. Not bad, adequate. Everybody makes money. But they would never have a mega hit because that came from the guys that were true believers who didn't really care that much if they made money. They just wanted to be the best. I'm thinking of the guys at id, for example. Cormac was, I want to push graphics technology forward. And Chris Weaver at Bethesda, these guys who were driven by something else besides just making a little money. Then there were, lots of guys who were just like, I like games. I got these guys around me. I'll build you a game, Chris, for the price you want to pay, but it's not going to change the world. So listening to pitches happened all the time. The various jobs I had to listen to pitches nearly every day. And in that position, you end up having to say no about 95% of the time. For one reason or another, either the idea seems silly. I had a guy come to me and say, I want to build a Wizard of Oz game where the main character is Jack Pumpkinhead, who's a stick figure with a pumpkin on his head, and he's got magical powers, and he teams up with Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes, and it's going to be kind of steampunk meets Wizard of Oz. And I remember thinking, what makes you think anybody would play that game? I ended up having to use the word niche quite a lot because you want to be polite, you want to hear them out and encourage their creativity. But I heard a lot of really silly pitches. So sometimes I get pitched, sometimes it was us going out and finding somebody to do something that we already had. And sometimes it was a blend. Sometimes it was the staff, the producers coming and saying, hey, I met these guys in this random city and they've got this thing and I think it's got potential. And for very reasonable money, we could see if it works. Over the course of my career, the cost of product development climbed every year. As the technology went ahead, the cost of taking advantage of the technology also runs ahead. As the price of building a good game went from $100,000 in 1984 to millions of dollars by the time I left the industry, your ability to take chances declines precipitously. You know, in the EA days, the first couple of years, we could build 12 or 15 products in a year and have 2 of them become hits and 2 of them kind of make a little money and 8 of them fail and lose money, but it was all right because the winners would cover for the losers. As the cost of development climbs, that becomes less and less the case. If you spend millions of dollars to build a game and it fails, everybody loses their job. I'm thinking about, what was it? Was it E.T.?
Yeah.
You know, those kinds of catastrophes got more and more expensive as the years went by. And so each company became more and more risk averse, saying, I can only afford 1 or 2 failures out of all the games we make. So calculating how to make sure, you know, that didn't happen was an enormous part of it.
Gotcha. And how much of a restriction on that calculation was Nintendo's limit on the number of games you could release on the system per year? I mean, that must have...
A huge factor. We were limited, I think, to 5 games a year. And, you know, so you had to think, okay, which of the possible 20 games that I could make should I make? And balancing all the risks and rewards for that question and for all the products themselves, you know, that's what we did all day.
Okay. And just really briefly, because you did mention Ghostbusters too, what was the investment in licenses like at that point? Because I mean, licenses, of course, are still a huge deal, especially in the mobile market nowadays. But back in the 80s, as a player back then, licenses were a very prominent aspect of the games that were coming out often. So what was the economics of that? How much would you have to pay for a license? Obviously different from license to license, but how did that impact development costs and so forth?
Oh yeah, they were a huge part of the calculation. You basically, you know, the conversation would be this: we can get this movie license. For example, I was pitched on Die Hard before it was made, when it was just a script, and they said, this is a new franchise. We think it's going to be a hit. You can have it for X amount of dollars. And you have to figure out, you know, if you spend that much money on a license, that limits how much you can spend on other things, like development or marketing. Activision got Ghostbusters because I think it was the #2 guy at the company at the time was sitting on an airplane next to a stranger who, when they got to chatting, the stranger said, we've got this new movie coming out in about a year. It's called Ghostbusters, and it's kind of a weird concept, but it's got potential. If you give us 25 grand, you can have the rights. And the company just took a flyer and got a great deal on a great license, as it turned out. I don't remember what the terms were for the Ghostbusters 2 license. But yeah, licenses in general are an absolutely crucial part of the financial analysis. At Electronic Arts, when they started licensing the players and the teams, it was way more expensive than any of us had ever dealt with before. And so I don't think, except for sports, EA did any licensing much of intellectual properties from Hollywood or books. Much.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of off the top of my head for EA was the Lord of the Rings license, but that doesn't come out until 2000. That's the one I can remember.
Yeah, much later. Later they got into Star Wars, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And the thinking around that question changed a lot a couple of years after I left EA, maybe 3 or 4 years after.
Gotcha. Okay. So I guess were you involved at all in the computer versions of the Die Hard license that Activision brought out?
No, no, I passed on the license at the time.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think a game came out based on Die Hard until sometime later.
Yeah.
Like maybe around the time Die Hard 2 came out. Somebody picked up the license. I don't remember who did it or how it did in terms of sales.
Well, I know, I want to say it was Activision that did computer game versions, but yeah, the console version, I think came from, may have been LJN, but I could be completely wrong on that one.
I
I'd
don't
have to
remember.
look it up. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. One of the fun things about that job and the jobs I had later were, and everyone in the industry has these, the misses when you make a mistake. The guy who passed on signing the Beatles.
Exactly.
A friend of
Well,
mine came, he said, I'm developing this game. It's going to be a smash hit. It's called Tomb Raider, and it's got a female protagonist with big breasts. And I said, really? I don't think so. That was one. Or the time EA passed on Print Shop.
really? EA passed on Print Shop?
Yeah, the developer of Print Shop brought us Print Shop. It was, he said, done. EA played with it. And we went back to him and said, I wasn't involved in this one, thank God. went back to him and said, we'd like to publish this, but we'd like you to make the following 10 changes to the product. And he took it to Broderbund, and Broderbund said, sure, we'll publish it as is. And that was that. Each of us who's involved in picking products has some misses in our our past.
Yeah, I'll believe it. And what would you call your biggest miss?
Well, I always think about that. I always think about Tomb Raider. I never had a chance to publish it. It never would have been. It was just my analysis was wrong because nobody had done that particular thing before. I thought this male-dominated market isn't going to want to be a female character in a game, and I was just dead wrong. Misses. Well, I certainly put out some products that, didn't do as well as I hoped. But that was usually a matter of degrees. Generally, my forecasting was fairly good. I was pretty cautious, and so I would say this product is probably going to sell somewhere between 50 and 100,000, or between 2 and 300,000. Later on at Sega, I was very involved in calculating how many units each product was going to sell. Because of Sega's heavy involvement on the software side, I was running the third-party side in terms of quality control, who gets to make games, which games, and how good do they have to be. Generally speaking, I think I had a pretty good batting average as a whole.
Cool. Now, after Activision, you go over to Sierra Online. If I'm reading.
Yeah, what happened? Bobby bought the company and implemented the correct strategy, and laid off all but about 10 people.
Oh wow!
In one day, I think it was 160 people or something. And he kept some of the very best people. Steve Ackrish, especially, comes to mind. Jerry Whiteley. I don't remember a couple of finance people, people who paid attention to the books, things like that. But almost everybody was let go with no warning or severance. We all could see it coming because the company was floundering based on the strategic changes of direction that kept happening. But I was suddenly unemployed. I had probably a year's worth of savings, perhaps. And I was kind of scared because now what was that? That was 1991, so I would have been 35 and unemployed. And so I basically, within 24 hours, got my resume out to every game company that was around. And Sierra was the first to contact me, like within 24 hours. Johnny Wilson said, come on up. They were in Oakhurst at the gate to Yosemite. And I'm a Yosemite guy. I grew up camping in Yosemite in the summers. So I was like, wow, I could live at the gate to Yosemite. Awesome. So I took that job, and I was there. They were doing graphic adventures. I was there for Space Quest 4 and Police Quest 3 and King's Quest 5, I think, and a few others. And it was very much right back to the marketing communication, turn it out kind of role for me, which was fun and comfortable. There I met some wonderful people, especially Kurt Busch, who is a longtime industry veteran as well. And I will never forget, Sega launched the Genesis. They called me and asked me which game should be bundled with the machine. And I gave them my recommendation, and they followed it, which I was stunned by.
Really? You recommended Altered Beast?
Yes, and wasn't qualified. I hadn't done the analysis to play all the games and decide which one would do the best job of helping them sell their machine. It was basically a stab in the dark. But I will never forget, 3 months, 4 months, maybe 5 months after I started. Oh, the first thing I did was I took a trip around the world. I went to Africa and Nepal, and then I started it at Sierra Online. I negotiated a delayed start date so I could, taste my first love again.
Gotcha.
Went to Kenya and India and Nepal and Thailand before I got back and started at Sierra. I was probably at Sierra about 5-6 months when there was an announcement over the loudspeaker. Will the following people please report to the conference room? And I was one of the people. Stuart Mulder, a couple of others. And I walked in there, I was like, what's up? And they said, look at this. And they put Sonic the Hedgehog on the big screen. The guy who called the meeting, he said, look at what Sega has done. Check this out. And I looked at it and I said, Sega is going to go from 4% market share to 45% market share over the next 14 months. Get ready. Things are going to get wild. And Sega called me, I don't know, a couple weeks later. And there was never a moment where I wasn't going to take that job. Because Sega, for the first couple of years, between Christmas of 91 and Christmas of 93, grew from, 20 guys to 1,200, and built a lot of good games and competed with Nintendo very successfully, especially in the arena of managing the third parties, which was my responsibility. It really helped a lot that Electronic Arts decided to reverse engineer the Sega machine and strike a deal with Sega so that Sega got a percentage of its usual cut, but took over the sports category, with EA. And so we basically owned sports via EA for the next few years. It also helped a lot that we were friendly with Acclaim, which had the rights to Mortal Kombat. And it also helped a lot that we had Sonic and other hit products coming from the Sega side as well. So the rapid growth, and there was a lot of camaraderie and good feeling in those years as Sega grew and succeeded.
Now, you were in charge of the relationships with the third parties. Now, Sega, obviously, you mentioned it before, the whole idea of people who were afraid of confronting Nintendo, and the Super Nintendo does come out a little bit later than the Genesis. Genesis hits in '89, I believe. The Super Nintendo is out in North America for Christmas of '92, if I remember correctly. So, or '91 probably.
I cannot remember. I know that the Genesis came first.
Yeah.
And the Super NES came a bit later. But by the time I got to Sega, those two machines were going head to head.
Okay. Yeah, so it must have been Christmas of 91. So the real question is, was there really a battle, or was it difficult for you to convince developers to jump ship or to bring product over? And was there a difference? Did you have any relationships with the Japanese developers, which seemed a little bit more reticent to make that shift?
Our messaging to the third-party publishers was basically, it's cost effective for you to put out a version of your game on both the Super NES and the Genesis. You know that, the numbers are clear. We want to make sure that the version for our machine is just as good as the version for the Super NES. There wasn't any sort of, what's the word, courting of anybody. We didn't go out and say, we'll make it worth your while to stop developing for Nintendo. It just wasn't a realistic conversation to have. Every now and then there'd be a small company that would come to us and say, look, to make games for your machine, we'll keep it exclusive to Sega for some amount of time.
Yeah.
But that was pretty occasional, pretty rare.
Gotcha. And I wanted to ask, what were the conditions? Because obviously in the NES days, you mentioned with the chip shortage and so forth, now obviously chip shortage wasn't as big a problem or wasn't a problem. So what were Sega's policies as far as the control of the number of games publishers could release, the quantities, and so forth?
We didn't have any controls on that. If you came to me and said, I want to build 1 million units of this game, every once in a while I would say that feels high. Now, the publishers were motivated to be careful with volumes, because if they bought 1 million copies of something, they were paying a lot of money up front for the manufacturing. And if they guessed wrong, if they guessed on the high side, the markdowns to move the products off the shelves, when you take the product price down from 49 to 39 to 19, kills all your profit. In fact, let's say you bought 1 million copies of something and sold through 800,000 at full price, but then you had to mark down the 200,000 to get them off the shelves because the product's life cycle was over. Those markdowns would eat all your profit from the first 800,000. It would kill the whole business venture. So the publishers were all very motivated to be very careful about volume. So we never had to say no. And I don't know that we were contractually allowed to say no in terms of volumes. We would give guidance if we were asked for it. And occasionally I was asked. I remember Larry Probst called me, or maybe it was at a conference, and he said, how many units of Skate or Die 2 am I going to sell? Because I was somewhat known for my read of kind of understanding the market. And my basic formula was, if you do a sequel, if Skate or Die comes out and is a huge hit, then you decide you want to do Skate or Die 2. If you want to sell the same amount of units as the original hit version, the quality of the sequel has to be twice as good. So you keep your same numbers, you have to really ramp the quality. Otherwise, you see a degradation in the property's value over time. So that would always be my first question. If you're going to do Mortal Kombat 2, how are you going to make it twice as good? And you want to, because you want to hit at least the same numbers that you did with the original. EA's genius was in understanding that by upgrading the stats within their sports games and attaching them to real characters, real performers, that they didn't have to double the quality of the technology every year. Whereas with something like Mortal Kombat, you really would kind of have to do that.
Yeah, that's true. While you're at Sega, I mean, and you're there for a fairly long stretch, for about 4 years, correct?
Let me think about that for a second. No, only 3 years. Three and a
Only
half.
three and a half years. Okay. And so you're there really for the period of the big 16-bit war, but you also are there when the add-ons for the Genesis come out, the Sega CD, and you're probably still there when the 32X launches, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. What was it like to deal with third parties when those peripherals came out? What was the messaging to the third parties for those?
Myself and my right-hand man, Steve Akrish, did a tour of the publishers with the 32X. I don't think we did this for the Sega CD, but we definitely did it for the 32X, where we went around and showed the technology. We showed a good game and described the challenges and the potential rewards. Each publisher did their own analysis about how much, if any, resources to put into yet another platform. Personally, I had really grave doubts about the 32X and the Sega CD because I was involved in third-party licensing and business development as well as a third-party publishing part. And what that meant was everybody who had an idea to work with Sega on some other business venture. So we had the guy who came and said, I want to do an exercise bicycle where it hooks into the Genesis and you can control your characters on the machine as you're pedaling. And guys with virtual reality headsets, really early prototypes, guys with all kinds of wild ideas. In that particular industry, there's just a lot of ideas. And my recommendation always was, unless this improves the quality of the experience dramatically, it's not worth doing it. If the 32X makes a huge leap forward in the game playing, fine, people will like it. If it's a marginal improvement, people don't want to spend the money for more hardware. And the Sega CD allowed the company to do some sort of interesting things, groundbreaking things. But the problem was, it was like having an oil tanker with a tiny hose. The limitation on the delivery of all that storage remained the same, which meant that it was really hard to massively increase the gameplay experience. And so neither of those two products, I thought, were particularly well thought through.
Okay, you get up to 1995. 3DO has been launched and so forth. Why do you decide to leave Sega?
It was a combination of several things. One was I was dissatisfied with the strategic decisions that were being made at Sega, the way they dealt with the launch of the Saturn, and some of the decisions that they were making sort of at the ground level. What was the name of that children's storytelling game device that Sega was launching at that time? It was kind of like a play school type of hardware product. I just thought Sega was run by a couple of guys from the toy industry. Kalinsky.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they came out of Mattel.
Oh, yeah. You're right. Kalinsky came from Mattel. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and they approached. I came from the software side, from Electronic Arts. So my attitude was, platforms, it's like razors and razor blades. You sell the razor for as little as you can get away with because the profit's in selling the blades. In our case, the software. Those guys wanted to put out new hardware all the time, like every year, and the way Mattel did. And I didn't think the model worked very well. That was one factor. The larger factor was that GT Interactive came to me and said, we want you to come take over marketing and product development, and we have Doom and Quake coming, and We also have the distribution rights for Windows 95 at Walmart, which is going to account for something like 30 to 40% of all sales for Windows 95. We're also going to go public in 6 months or less. And they waved a package in front of me that was, let's just say my pitiful abilities to say no were tested.
Okay, actually, okay. I need to ask about that, but before we do, the Sega Saturn launch is, I guess, infamous would be an easy way to describe it. When did you find out, and how did you find out that the launch was going to be early, and what feedback or effect did that have on any of the relationships you had established with third parties to deliver software for the system?
By the time that decision was made, I had moved out of my position running third party and business development and had taken over the number 2 slot in marketing behind a new marketing guy named Ribera, I want to say. He came from outside the industry. He was a very charismatic, likable guy, quick, funny, but he didn't have the years in the industry. They put me as his sort of number 2 in marketing to kind of fix that, to sort of help guide the decision making. I was not given any voice in that decision making process, and I was opposed to it. And the third parties were angry and blindsided by it. I would have counseled against it if anybody had asked me, but they were feeling pressures, of their own, and felt driven to do that. I think Kalinsky felt like his options were limited, and he had to make a bold statement to try to generate a huge amount of buzz fast. And it may have succeeded in some ways, but I thought the costs were too high.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, then let's talk about GT Interactive. As far as I understand it, they did have the exclusive rights for software distribution at Walmart. I don't know if it was still the case in '95 when you joined, if they still had that exclusivity, or it was a partial exclusivity or something. How did that actually work?
Yeah, they had that already when I joined the company. That was a deal they did with Walmart. Basically, Walmart was like, dealing with all these software companies is too much trouble. You become the racker for the shelves for that department. You decide what goes on the shelves. And so GT set that up, and that's really how they got their start. Once they had that in place, they were able to get id. id basically said, we can make a better deal with them than we can with any of the major publishers in terms of the cost structures. So now they had Windows 95 and Doom, which was a magnificent 1-2 punch. Way to grow. But these guys, the Carey brothers, who owned GT, owned hundreds of apartment buildings. They had interests in 23 different industries. They owned a fleet of jets.
Wow.
They had their fingers in a lot of pies, and they saw this one as this year's, quick opportunity. They brought in Ron Shamowitz to run things. He was out of the record industry, and they brought in Harry Rubin to be their kind of operations guy, day-to-day guy, in terms of running the deals with all the different publishers and developers. And they brought in me to get original content developed, get new games built to compete with these things. We did some good products. We funded the first Unreal, which the engine is still going.
Yeah.
We did Oddworld, which sold more than 1 million copies. We did a few other successful products, and we did some dogs also. It was very challenging couple of years for me. The main reason was that the company was in Manhattan, and my life and all my contacts and everyone was in the Bay Area in California. So I convinced them to let me set up an office in San Mateo, and I went back and forth. But what they really wanted me to do was fly around the country and sign every deal there was. They had this idea that you could lock up the development community.
Okay.
No matter how I waved my arms, they couldn't come off that idea. They had really, through luck and talent, come across a couple of huge things right away, and then they went on a signing bender. They just signed everything that came across the transom. I remember my first day. They had a couple products coming that were going to come in. This was mid-September. They showed me a couple games that they had signed that were going to launch around Thanksgiving. And they said, tell me about these. What's going to happen with these? And I played them. And I went to Ron and I said, neither of these products is going to sell at all. These are both total failures. And he's like, we already sold 100,000 of each. And I said, well, you either shut that down or you're going to eat them all. Because these are not going to succeed. And when I came in, they didn't have a QA department.
Wow.
They trusted the developers to do their own QA. They saw themselves as a distributor. And I said, look, if you're going to be selling other people's products, you can't trust them to find all the bugs. And we're going to take the hit if they get returned. So there's a whole way of doing this business. And it was new to them. It was new to all of them. That first day, I walked into a board meeting, and all the vice presidents were wearing white shirts and ties and suits. And it was like walking into Morgan Stanley, or, it was very New York, very old school. None of them had any experience with software or publishing at all. And so it was a challenging couple of years because I spent almost all my time on an airplane, going around the country, meeting with developers and signing deals. And my health started to suffer from it. And just too much travel and too much stress. And so I left after a couple of years and retired.
Gotcha. And so GT, you retired from GT, but you didn't stay retired.
4 years later, I was retired for 4 years, spending most of my time in Big Sur, California. I bought some land down there and had a little cabin, and it was walking distance to the beach. My next door neighbor was Al Jardine of the Beach Boys.
Oh, wow.
Sweet little community, very beautiful, very rugged, full of, cowboy hippies, frontiersmen, and artists, and I really liked it down there. And so, but in 1991, I got a call from a couple of contacts saying,
2001.
Sorry, yeah, 2001,
Okay.
saying we'd like you to come run marketing for Konami. We have Metal Gear Solid coming, and we need somebody to launch it, as well as Dance Dance Revolution and some other products. And I said, I was kind of reluctant. I was pretty happy being retired, but they changed my mind and I joined them. And we had a lot of fun for a couple of years. And now that was purely marketing. That was basically just Marcom again. But we did some good marketing when we, the best part of that was the turnaround. They had a new CEO, a new head of product development, and me, a new marketing guy. And the previous year, the company had lost, I'm going to say, $23 million on $80 million of revenue.
Wow.
I came in and I cut the marketing budget by 3/4, I think. I took it from $23 million to $6 million. And we tripled the sales. Because my predecessor, who I never met, who went on to an illustrious career at Nike, hired the most expensive advertising agency in New York City to do things like sell sheets and packages. So a sell sheet, this is a one-pager that you'd give to the sales force that sells the product, announces it, prices it, and has hopefully a headline that attracts attention. He was spending like $250,000 on creative for that, which is something that, I could do in 2 hours on my desk for nothing, for free. They were spending $1 million, I think, per ad campaign on creative. And I was like, our TV ads should be all gameplay. I can make TV ads for 20 grand. I don't need to spend millions of dollars on this. So we were able to turn the company around. And that was very rewarding. The next couple of years for Konami were the best years they ever had. But Konami, from the beginning, from the time I first heard of them, has replaced all their American executives every 2 years like clockwork.
Really?
Yeah. For a number of reasons. The founder and president of Konami, I don't even know if he's still alive anymore, organized Konami, the corporation, on medieval feudal samurai structures, meaning he had 6 or 7 different divisions, and he encouraged the president of each division to compete with all the other divisions. So you'd have the home software division competing with the coin-op division, competing with the gambling machine division, competing with the toy division, and they would literally sabotage each other and encourage their staffs not to talk to their peers in the various, even though you needed each other. So it was a very poisonous corporate. And he would say, okay, at the end of the year, whoever makes me the most money gets $1 million bonus, and the rest of you get cuts to your salary. So Jesus. A very strange way of organizing a corporation. And the fallout of that was, I had heard that there was a kind of a truism or a stereotype that some Japanese companies treated their American and European employees as second-class citizens. It was absolutely not true at Sega. My boss was a Japanese guy. His boss was the number 2 at the company in Tokyo. And I really enjoyed all my Japanese coworkers at Sega. And I got to Konami and was introduced to a whole nother way of looking at the world. And so I was pretty happy to have 2 really good, successful years there and then retire again.
Gotcha.
And move to Hawaii. Well, the water in Big Sur is so cold. That's the problem. I love surfing and snorkeling, body surfing especially. And I'd get up in the morning in Big Sur and I'd walk down to the beach and I'd look at the surfers and the people walking their dogs, and I would think to myself, Hawaii's out there. This water's too cold and there's great white sharks here. Anyway, yeah, that's the story of my career. I've been retired now since 4 years, from 97 to 01, and then I guess 17 years since 03.
Not too shabby. And never thought of going back?
I had a conversation with Ben Gordon just a couple of days ago. He left Electronic Arts as one of the co-founders and guiding geniuses, and joined Kleiner Perkins, and is a venture capitalist now. And all of my former coworkers who have talked to him have said that he's just the warmest guy. And he pinged me on LinkedIn just a few days ago and said, his exact line was, "Hey, Chris, I was wondering what your genius self is up to these days," which is very flattering way of starting a conversation. And I told him, and he asked me if I ever thought about coming back into the industry. And I said, if I thought I could wake up feeling passionate about something, then yeah, I could be seduced. But I'm pretty happy. I'm very content.
I can understand that. So, looking back at your career, I mean, you bounced a lot back and forth between computer software, console software. Uh, you saw different generations of it. You saw the budgets for games balloon and the changing dynamics of profitability structures. Looking back at all of that, what do you think was the one change in the market and in the industry that you were most surprised by, that took you by surprise, that you didn't expect? And what was the biggest change that you expected to be big that just fizzled out or didn't really have the impact you expected it to?
I can't say I was surprised by any of the changes. I pretty much expected the changes to come as they came. It was predictable when Microsoft approached Sega and said, we want to do some joint ventures. My comment to Kalinske was, they're planning to take over the business. This is what they do. I had a couple of meetings with Bill Gates, and he was very engaging and interesting. He rocks back and forth in his chair at the boardroom and waves his arms as he's talking about the future. And he looks like my brother. And my staff would nudge me and go, are you guys related? You act exactly the same. And that's what they did. It was very predictable. So we knew. Those of us who paid attention knew what was going to happen there. It was very predictable that Sony, because they controlled chip production, was going to be able to compete very aggressively, very quickly when they came out and competed with the Saturn. Those changes were all pretty predictable. The biggest surprise was the way the market reacted to the NES when they launched it with Zelda and Mario in 1986. That was a thermonuclear blast that took all the oxygen out of the room. I had a friend who went to New York because they launched it in New York first. Mm. And the amazing, fast success of the NES in New York and then worldwide was bigger and faster than anybody that I knew expected. And it was where the truism that software drives hardware became widely understood, really, for the first time. It really became clear that if you were going to launch a hardware platform and you did not have a killer app like Mario, you're in trouble, big trouble. And so that was the biggest change, the most important change, and the scale of it was much bigger than anybody expected. Nobody, I don't think, at least nobody that I talked to, understood that after the horrendous crash of the Atari video game market in 1983, dragging down almost every company involved, millions and tens of millions of copies being buried in the desert, lots of bankruptcies. I don't think what anybody fully understood was that the pent-up demand for a similar platform that was better managed was out there. So that was that. Everything that happened after that, the waves of technology, the ways that the publishers have adapted, the way they've been forced to become risk averse like Hollywood. You know, what is it, 90% of all Hollywood movies in the top 20 are all IP sequels now. Yeah. And the same is true in games, pretty much. On the home systems now, where it's kind of like the Wild West, the way it was in 1984, is on handheld. But how many games are coming out every day? 10,000 a year, more? Unless you somehow get into the top 10, unless you become the book on the airport shelves, you're not going to make any money. You have to be Angry Birds or Tetris or Candy Crush. You have to have a breakthrough, or you're basically hosed. If you're one of the 9,999 games that is just another game for the phone, the good news is you can afford to make a game for a small amount of money, like we could in '84. The bad news is the competition is just the din, the noise in the market is such that I can't see how anybody has any fun. at least if you're spending, $60 million to make Red Dead Redemption 2, and you have to sell 10 million copies at least in order to even survive, at least you can have some fun with it. You can be pretty sure you're making something great that will sell a lot and that the company will succeed. And I praise those guys for doing Red Dead 1. The idea of doing an open world RPG style cowboy game was pretty gutsy, especially at a time when it cost a lot of money to make it. And they pulled it off. They did it right. My favorite games these days are those kind of games. I like the huge open world exploration, role-playing type games like Elder Scrolls and Fallout and Red Dead and those kinds of games. Those are my favorite. Those and strategy games. Civilization and SimCity type strategy games are my favorite kind of category games to play. Now that I'm retired, I can afford to play games all day, which I often do. Well, I typically play from noon to 6 most days. If I don't go snorkeling I'll go maybe do something beachy in the morning, then come home and play my games. And I'm kind of making up for when I was working, because from 1984 to 2003, except for the 4 years in between, I was always working too hard to play games.
Oh, man.
I didn't have enough time. I was, long hours, corporate stress. I typically fall in love with one game a year and just play it to death. I did that with Starflight and Tetris and Marble Madness. And, but that's all I had time for. These days, I can indulge myself a little bit more.
That was going to be my final question is, as a person who grew up with games, are you still gaming? And apparently that is the answer. And it's good to hear.
I still play chess with my friends. I still play cribbage with my family. I still play board games whenever anybody wants to. But living out here in Hawaii, it's hard to get together with people for board games, at least my old friends in California. So mostly I'm playing video games these days. My wife and I sit around and play various things for, a good chunk of the day. And the nice thing is you can take them to the beach if you want.
Very true, very true. Okay, well, that basically exhausts my questions. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't?
Nothing really comes to mind. The trap for me in these kinds of interviews that I've done over the years is trying to be charitable to the many, many really boneheaded mistakes that I saw and made. Some of them were mine, many of which were not. But if I get into the analysis of why companies succeeded or failed at any given time, it's really a tempting shorthand to say, well, those two guys in a room got it all wrong. That's the big challenge for me, is to try to understand what's pushing people in which directions when, and why they do the things they do.
Gotcha.
But no, I can't think of any questions you should have asked. You could have said, what did Tripp get wrong about, unfolding of his career? How did his fellow executives just screw him to the wall when they could? Personal stuff, about all the players. And I'm kind of glad to stay away from that stuff.
I to be honest with you, I see little value in that, at least from a historical standpoint. That's more of a gossipy thing. My fascination with all this, and the reason I spend time on it, is to try to fill in the gaps and understand the evolution of it. How, in the industry that started with just basically, we suddenly have this technology that we can do something with. We can alter the pictures on the TV. And how that goes from this raw technology to truly the only new art form of the last, what, at
50
least
years.
100 years? I mean,
Yeah.
since the creation of cinema, uh, there has been no other new art form. And the fact that I'm now 43, it's all really happened essentially within my lifetime. And I grew up with it, and I started voraciously reading magazines and any article I could find with the creators and I tried to follow which companies were doing what. And just having the opportunity to get some of the insight of how these things came about. What were the stepping stones? How did it evolve as far as a business? What was tried? What failed? What succeeded? Why did it fail? What were the plans? That's what interests me. I mean, you can turn it into a bunch of sordid little stories, and occasionally that's interesting for whatever reason, but there's enough people doing that already out there. There's enough of that stuff already out on the internet, and I prefer to try to focus on really the evolution of the business because
I think that's a good call. I really do. Thinking back on it, the big hits and the big changes almost always started with a gasp, with a wow. I remember the first time we saw a character walk into a 3D room, Castle Wolfenstein, the predecessor to Doom and that whole category of gaming. And everybody just went, holy cow, look at that. First time we saw Sonic just whipping across the screen. The first time, we used to talk a lot about it, the gee whiz factor, how, what Bing used to say is, and what Stan used to say is, modern people in today's world, and this was in the 80s, are hit with something like 8,000 messages a day between TV and radio and their friends and magazines and everything else. We're just bombarded with messaging. And in that world, it's very hard to break through. And they've done research on it, and you get 8 words.
Yeah.
You have 8 words, and the response has to be, I get it, meaning I understand it, and I want it. You have 8 words to do that. When it comes to selling a game, you have to be able to punch them in the gut with the message, with whatever it is. And so, yeah, most of these changes that we've seen started that way, with some kind of gee whiz moment where you just kind of went, this is astounding. Miyamoto at Nintendo, he understood something first, which was the feel of the gameplay. That is, the communication between your thumb and the character on the screen has to be perfect. It has to feel like exactly what he's trying to convey. Cormac down at id understood what you could do with the graphics. The simple gameplay dynamics that we see, many of which were first tried on coin-op machines. Things like Tetris or Bubble Shooter or all the simple centipede type games. When I started Electronic Arts, it was the Wild West. I remember Mark Lewis, who ran Europe for EA for many years, had a piece of paper on the wall of his cubicle, and it was like the rules of software development. And one of them was sequels never work. Because the company had tried Archon 2, which had done well. The next one was Nobody Knows Anything. There was just this list of things people thought they knew about how this new world was going to unfold. But he was right. Nobody really knew much of anything. It was the Wild West, and we were just throwing stuff at the wall to see what would work. It's possible that the Pumpkinhead steampunk Wizard of Oz thing could have been a smash hit, but it never got true. Yeah. So are we done?
I think that's it. That's a great place to end it. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, And if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.